when they're controlling the political debate, right? When they're controlling what you can say about them, how do you change this within the context of the present system, which depends upon political debate?
Here at Liberty and Finance, we're licensed brokers with Miles Franklin. We are standing by the inventory, ready to make sure you get what you need, even into the wee hours of night and on weekends, because preparedness doesn't stop. Call us, 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237.
Hey everyone, this is Elijah K. Johnson with Liberty and Finance. And back with us today, our good friend, Dr. Edwin Vieira. He is a constitutional attorney. Dr. Edwin Vieira, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure.
It's great to have you, especially what we're seeing right now in the government. We're seeing some concerning things with respect to free speech, and we'd like to get your perspective on this. We're seeing under the Department of Homeland Security, there's the formation just last week of the Disinformation Government Board, which a lot of people, conservatives, have been concerned about. And have been talking about this and comparing it to the Ministry of Truth, kind of an Orwellian theme there. And it's very interesting. The Secretary of Homeland Security says the board will not monitor American citizens and will not infringe on free speech. And the purpose of the board is actually to, protect free speech. But, it seems like whenever there is another board created by the government and more government control, it does the exact opposite. It reduces our freedom. And the purpose of the board is technically to reduce the false information regarding election interference, the Russia-Ukraine war, and human smuggling at the U.S.-Mexican border. But often, as we see the government expand and these new boards being created, it seems like it's never an increase of freedom. It's always a reduction of freedom. And I wanted to get your take on this. Are you concerned about this new disinformation board that has been created?
Well, everyone should be, because at a minimum it shows that these people can't think logically, right? You're going to have a disinformation board in order to protect free speech. They're going to suppress certain kinds of speech in order to protect free speech. That's what Mayorkas said. You just quoted him about that, which on its face is nonsense. That's the 1984 concept, right? Freedom is slavery, right? Contradictory terms are equated. The problem you have with these people in the so-called Biden administration is either they don't know what they're talking about, or they don't care what they say as to whether it's logical or rational or comports with legal principles. I mean, there's a famous case, famous to lawyers, I suppose, not to the average person, Gertz versus Robert Welch, in which the court says there is no such thing as a false idea under the First Amendment. However pernicious an idea may seem, we depend for its correction not on the conscience of judges or juries, but on the competition of other ideas. Well, that is a little bit hyperbolic, because there are some kinds of speech, physical speech or writing, if you will, in some cases, which we do depend upon the determination of judges and juries to sort out truth from fiction. So you can think of such things as fraud, as a classical example, criminal or civil, where one goes to a judge in a jury civil action to determine the truth of a particular statement that may have been made, or defamation, where you're looking at the truth of a statement that may have been made that in some way impugns the character of an individual. But those concepts, things like contempt of court, where someone speaks out in a manner that obstructs or interferes with the operation of a court, or the classic example, of course, is perjury, where someone lies under oath, and we're looking to the truth of actually the falsity of what that testimony may be. But those were, and I don't like the word exceptions, because they were not really exceptions to the First Amendment. They were simply not ever considered to be part of freedom of speech at all. And the Constitution refers not to freedom of speech as a generality, but in the First Amendment it refers to the freedom of speech. That is, freedom of speech as it was understood at the time that the Constitution was enacted, then the Bill of Rights, late 1700s. Right? So there are areas in which things which could be called misinformation or disinformation would be subject to some kind of civil or criminal, perhaps administrative penalty. So what are we talking about? Well, misinformation is where somebody makes a mistake. Right? They're simply confused, or they don't have enough evidence to make a cogent statement. They make a statement that's simply wrong. But there's no malicious intent involved. Disinformation is where someone makes a statement with some kind of malicious intent. He knows that that statement is false, or he is willfully blind to the falsity of the statement, or he's recklessly indifferent to the falsity of the statement, and he's putting that statement out for some kind of malicious purpose, usually to deceive the hearers or the readers in some way, and to make them act in a manner that's not in accordance with their true interests. So these categories actually exist in theory, but the question is, if they don't fall within one of these so-called exceptions to the First Amendment, what business does the government have in dealing with them through some kind of administrative process that is going to do what? Is going to expose these statements as disinformation. I'm glad that they say disinformation, because if they got into the area of misinformation, that an infinite amount of activity they'd have to be involved in. But if you stop and think about it for one moment, the political process and this kind of typical electoral propaganda that's put out is full of disinformation. The candidates are always misrepresenting, and usually intentionally, the positions of their opponents and making promises that they really don't intend to keep because they know they can't keep them. Right? If there were an actual disinformation board that were working on that premise, then the political process in this country would probably have to be shut down completely. So one wonders exactly what they're going to do and how they're going to judge what levels or types or areas of disinformation they're supposed to get into. That's number one. That's a real problem. Then number two is, well, how are they going to ferret out the existence of this disinformation? Obviously, some people will broadcast disinformation on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, the various social platforms. But maybe they'll be putting it out through emails. Maybe they'll be putting it out through other sources on the web, right? So is there going to be surveillance that accompanies this process? Because you have to find out what the people are saying with respect to disinformation before you can deal with their disinformation. Are we going to have procedures whereby there's violation of the Fourth Amendment, right? They're searching electronic records or electronic communications without a warrant. Apparently the CDC was doing it. It just came out a few days ago that they were involved in that kind of activity. Right? So are they going to, besides questionable activity under the First Amendment, are they going to be violating the Fourth Amendment in order to obtain the information about what they call the disinformation so they can expose it and maybe punish it? And then, of course, the question would be, if they start putting out nothing more than this agency's version of what disinformation is supposed to be, and it turns out itself to be false, either because it's misinformation or it's their own disinformation, and they've harmed someone, who is going to be held responsible and accountable, and how for that harm? And I give you the example of the computer technician who had the original access to the Hunter Biden laptop. And he looked at that, made a copy of it, gave one copy to Rudy Giuliani, and he turned over the laptop to the FBI because he believed that there were national security and other serious problems involved in the activities that laptop evidenced. Right? And then the activity of the FBI was to sit on it, to hide it, and New York Post reported on it, and all the rest of the media hid it. And what was it, 10 or 15 experts from the intelligence agencies, former honchos and intelligence agencies, well, this was all Russian disinformation. Now, there was an interesting example of how this agency would work. Right? Something comes out, the honchos in the agency make a determination and say, well, this is disinformation. What happened to that fellow? Well, according to him, because he's now filing a defamation lawsuit against various people, including, I think, Adam Schiff, Congressman Adam Schiff, he lost his business. People turned against him. So his reputation in the community was destroyed because he was viewed as some kind of Russian agent or propagandist. He received threats to the extent that he had to leave where he lived, go someplace else. And now he's suing because what he said was true and what they said about him was false, so it's a defamatory situation. Okay. So you look at that and assume that those 15 people, 10 or 15 honchos from the intelligence agencies, were on this disinformation board, and they came out with this result. You'd say, well, wait a minute, how did you come out with this result? Did you look at the laptop? Did you take some information that was given to you by the FBI or some other people with experience in these kinds of communications that would be found on a laptop, and they told you that? I mean, what was the background of that? So there's another problem that we have. Disinformation Board is going to claim that certain things are disinformation. How they find out about them is problem number one. But then number two is, on what basis do they say it's disinformation? Who is supposed to check the fact checkers, right? And here we run into a parallel in criminal law, which is called the Brady Rule. And the Brady Rule says that prosecutors in a criminal case are required by the Constitution to turn over any information that they have or that they know about to the defendant's attorneys if that information could be exculpatory. That is, if that information could help the defendant to establish that he is not guilty, the prosecutors have to turn that information over. So that may be information that the police have or investigative laboratory has, whatever. If the prosecution knows about it or could find out about it, it's supposed to turn that information over. It's not allowed to come into a criminal case and just present a case based on the information it wants the jury to hear when it knows that there's this other information there that might be valuable to the defendant. Well, the same thing would be true of a Disinformation Board. Why are they not? Would they not be in the same position as a prosecutor? Because essentially that's what they're doing, whether we have criminal sanctions to disinformation or not. They are prosecuting the so-called disinformers out there, saying that they're lying or they're propagandizing, whatever it is they're doing. Why would the Disinformation Board not be subject to the same kind of rule that they would have to turn over all the information that they have that goes contrary to their determination? Right? The First Amendment applies to them. Constitutional limitations apply to them. Why wouldn't something along the line of the Brady Rule apply to them? Right? Well, we haven't heard about that. But obviously, if that were the case, and all of that information were to come out, the information from the Disinformation Board comes forward, and they've got on one side what they claim proves that the statement made by these other people is disinformation. On the other side, here's all the evidence to the contrary. Who's going to decide which body of evidence should be taken as true? Disinformation Board is supposed to decide that? Or are we the people supposed to decide that? So you could say, well, if all the Disinformation Board does is disclose information, it collects information and simply discloses this on a website, the pros and the cons. Well, I don't know. I think that would be a vast waste of time unless they were getting this information from some secret source, because they're talking about Russian propaganda. Right? Maybe they're getting information from the NSA or something that is able to break into some aspect of the Internet and demonstrate that information is actually misinformation coming from some Russian source. All right, that's fine. But that's apparently not what they're planning on doing. They're not an information agency in the sense that they're simply going to collect this and lay it all out for the people and say, you make your own decisions, Mr. and Mrs. America. They're going to make the decision for you. Then the question becomes, so what? Well, they can make a decision and it will have an impact on an individual simply because that false information is out there, such as this computer man who had been viciously attacked, even though what he said about that Hunter Biden laptop was absolutely true. All that has been now admitted. Right? So he suffered repercussions from the disinformation that was put out by the U.S. government people. They didn't directly harm him. They didn't attempt to prosecute him. They didn't fine him in some way. They just defamed him. And now he has to sue individuals. He has to go through the lengthy court process, to get back his reputation and hopefully some monetary damages that he has suffered. But so this question is, what is this Disinformation Board going to do? Well, they could do something simply like that. They could harm somebody's reputation by putting out disinformation. Or perhaps they could say, at some stage down the line, well, when we determine that there's disinformation, we can fine you. Or we can send this case over to the federal prosecutors because maybe you've put out this disinformation and presented it in some way to a government agency. Now, you know, there's an interesting statute, Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 1001, which says that if you as an individual lie, falsely, make some false statement, doesn't have to be under oath, just a false statement, to an officer or agent of the federal government acting within his scope of authority, and that false statement is relevant to what he's doing, to this particular function, that it's a criminal violation. You can be prosecuted, convicted, and sent to jail for that. So that's an interesting question, whether at some stage down the line, this Disinformation Board will make some sort of claim that once they've exposed disinformation, they can cause you to be enjoined. They can go into some court and enjoin you. Or they could go to the internet provider or Twitter or Facebook or whatever and demand that those private companies suppress your speech, cut off your Twitter account, cut you off from Facebook, whatever it would be. Or maybe beyond a civil fine, there's some theory that they're going to come up with that will say, well, this is now a criminal activity once we've determined that you're engaged in the promulgation of Russian propaganda. Oh, my goodness, maybe you're under the Espionage Act now. Right? How far does this go? Well, no one has said. Right? This is all in the dim future as to what's going to occur. But typically with this kind of a structure, open-ended structure, in order for them to become effective, they're going to have to move in that direction. They're going to have some teeth behind the threat. And I don't think the teeth will be simply that they'll tell Twitter that Twitter has to, or Facebook or whatever it is, has to put a disclaimer on your tweet or on your Facebook page that you are a purveyor of disinformation. They'll have to go further than that. So we can look forward to, extensions of this. And then you look at the things that Mayorkas said he's going to be concerned with. Well, some aspects of illegal immigration. Why is that? Because illegal immigration problem is becoming worse and worse and worse, and nobody can deny it anymore. And between now and November, it's going to become probably catastrophic. That's number one. So it's a big political issue. The second one is electoral fraud. Or electoral, let's say, misconduct. Various kinds of misconduct in connection with elections. Why are we concerned about that? Well, because in the 2020 election, there were a large number of people who made claims that there was fraud here, there, and various places in the country of a significant amount and had serious consequences, to wit that Biden was supposedly elected instead of Trump. Right? And we know the courts looked the other way on that. Right? There was never a final determination through an actual jury trial or trial before a special master on any of those cases. Supreme Court didn't want to touch it. Right? So we've opened up the possibility that you can have massive electoral fraud and the courts will not correct the situation. Well, therefore, what do you want to do? If you're going to engage in massive electoral fraud, you don't want people to talk about it. All right? Now, there's another problem we may have here. Why would they be concerned with so-called disinformation related to electoral fraud unless they thought there would be a lot of that coming out in the next election or the election thereafter? And then, of course, Russian propaganda, Russian disinformation. Well, you remember that we had the supposed Russian collusion theory that came out from the Clintons and the Democratic group activists and so forth, that this special counsel Durham is investigating quite after the fact, obviously, right? A little too late to investigate that now after it's already had its effect on the election, right? But there we go again. That was predicated upon what? The Steele dossier, which went back to the Russian involvement here, all fictional. Now, does the new Disinformation Board, do they intend to bring that up so that they can rerun another one of these fictional operations that we've already seen? So what I'm getting at is it is possible on the dark side, if you're a cynical individual, that you could look at this Disinformation Board and say not simply that it's stupid, not simply that it's contradictory to the principles of the First Amendment, but that it is also geared to generate political disinformation in favor of one particular political party, set of candidates, whatever it is, along the lines of things that have been done in the past. To repeat that and to make it even more difficult for people to talk about electoral fraud, to talk about the falsity of Russian propaganda theories, et cetera, right? So this thing has nothing to do with disinformation in the sense of, well, it's really well-meaning, even though they may not be, entirely capable of doing what they want to do. That it's malign to begin with. Now, if you look at even the simple cases in the courts, defamation, fraud, kind of your classic examples, right, where the gist of the case is that the defendant was engaged in the dissemination of some kind of information. Right? He lied about the worth of the land that he was selling, or he defamed an individual by telling falsehoods about what that individual had done so as to destroy the man's reputation. Okay. What happens in our system? Well, that goes into a court. And there are rules of evidence. And the evidence that's presented, the claims that are presented of various facts, supposed facts, have to sift through the sieve, if you will, of the rules of evidence. And only the facts that comply with the rules of evidence are considered to be actual facts, right? You may have allegations, you may have statements made by witnesses, you may have documents of various kinds, but they have to meet certain evidentiary tests of reliability. Okay, and that is done through a process that is based on what's called the adversary system. You have a lawyer on one side who's arguing that these witnesses' statements or these documents or whatever are in fact factual for this reason, that reason, so forth and so on. And you have an argument on the other side saying, no, they're not. And then it's presented to a jury, or in some cases a judge. You could have a judge trial, but often it's a jury. And the jurors decide what's true and what's false. And then they come to a verdict in favor of one or the other party. Right? Well, who's making that decision? Well, it's the jury. All right? It's not the government. Even if you have a criminal trial where they're talking about criminal fraud, it's not the government, not the prosecutors that make that decision. It's not even the judge makes the decision. It's the jury. It's these people, it's the American people, the 12 of them that are sitting there in the jury box that make that decision based upon this advocacy process, two-sided advocacy process, which is adversarial. Right? You don't have simply one position presented and then the other party doesn't get to say anything, or the other party is immediately treated as probably lying. Right? Well, it seems to me the principle of this Disinformation Board is contrary to that as well. They're not leaving the determination, I would think, to the people, except in the sense that the kind of the trivial Disinformation Board that would simply publish their opinion. They say, well, Jones said this, and we think it's wrong, right? Because our intelligence agencies have information that says this wrong. We can't tell you what that is because that's classified. But then they put out something like that, right? And you say, well, okay, there's nothing really going to come of this except for the possible defamation problem. If you're talking about a Disinformation Board that's going to have teeth, fine someone, refer someone for some kind of criminal prosecution, maybe they'll get another statute saying that you can't put out certain kinds of disinformation, or if you put out disinformation that's somehow tied to Russia, that comes under some kind of Espionage Act theory or whatever. Right? Well, if they're going to do that, how is that going to be challenged in an adversarial process? Right? The target of that, because the Disinformation Board is not simply saying something is disinformation, they're saying, well, here's the person who put it out. Jones has been putting this out on the internet, and it's disinformation, it's Russian propaganda. What is Jones' recourse in this case? Does he have some opportunity to challenge the Disinformation Board? Well, in the past, there was a thing called the Subversive Activities Control Board. And the purpose of that was to ferret out subversive activities, primarily activities by Communist Party-related or front groups. And that was maybe similar in principle here. But the idea ultimately was that that board was going to be subject to all sorts of judicial review, and in fact, that's what happened. Large numbers of people who were in one way or another investigated, or I can't say really charged, they were found by the board to be political action organizations that were communist fronts or transmissions, whatever. They sued. They have a large number of cases in the Supreme Court which cut that thing way back, and finally it's gone now, basically. You know, never hear of that concept anymore. Because it was almost an impossible thing to administer consistent with the First Amendment and the Fifth Amendment, right? Because a lot of times when these people were saying that activities were communist-related, the individuals who were being charged simply took the Fifth Amendment, which they're entitled to. Right? So there was no way to enforce this effectively. It became more of an exposure operation than it did a suppression operation. So if that's all the disinformation agency is going to do, you say, well, it's very ill-advised. It probably is something that the First Amendment, you'd probably be able to get some kind of injunctions against some of the things would be doing under the First Amendment. It might be possible to sue them for defamation. Think about how difficult that is and how many years it would take in the courts to establish that. But that would be the limit of it. And after a short period of time, it might just disappear because it proved to be ineffective. But I don't think that's their purpose. I think their initial purpose is looking to the next couple of elections. That's why they picked at least those three things. Number one, the illegal immigration, because that's going to be a continuing hot. That's never going to go away until they correct it. They don't intend to correct it. So that could very well be a very serious issue this November or, in 2024. And then the other two, which are tied to electoral manipulation. Because we look at what happened. We look at what happened in 2016. We look at what happened in 2020. And what were they? Right? Electoral fraud, the question of electoral fraud, disinformation claimed as to electoral fraud, and then the Russian involvement, Russian propaganda, Russian collusion. Remember the term that was used, collusion. Right? So you look at those three and say, well, there's probably another motive here. This is probably a political situation or political goal, long-term political goal that they're looking for here. They want to shut down people who may question these aspects of future events. Because political disinformation is inherent in essentially any election that you can pick in this country. The politicians are constantly, let's say, exaggerating. And in many cases, they're just plain little lying, dissimulating as to what their opponents are saying or as to what they intend to do. And doesn't that have an effect in every election in this country? Far more so than Russian propaganda does. But are people talking about Disinformation Board to clean up American elections so that only the truth is told? And then if that were the case, how would you do it? Because a lot of this is opinion, all right? Even if you come back to something like the Russian-Ukrainian conflict that's going on right now, there are lots of areas of disagreement which relate back to a series of historical events on which there are serious differences of opinion, and those differences of opinion can be justified, or at least explained, by reference to facts and interpretation of things that actually happened, right? So they talk about the Minsk Accords and the failure of the Ukrainians to go along with that, and then the question of were they going to become a NATO member, and would that affect the Russian security, and what did Putin think about this and that, and so forth and so on. And you can look at that, and you can have very different opinions about it without ever saying that any of those opinions relate to disinformation in the sense of intentional falsification of facts in order to gain some political advantage in the public sphere. And yet we know perfectly well that that's exactly what the people in the media do every day with respect to this Russian-Ukrainian business. Right? Depends which side you're listening to in the media. You're going to get what amounts to a media disinformation presentation. One will be vilifying Putin, the other will be trying to rationalize or justify what he's doing. One will be lauding Zelensky, the other will be saying, well, Zelensky is just a puppet of these oligarchs, what have you. Right? How is one going to sort that out except through what you find, the statement found in the Supreme Court decisions, robust debate in the public sphere, and the people to come to their own determinations about these facts, which may, of course, lead to 2 or 3 different opinions. You never resolve it. Right? You'll never come to a full majority in the country as to what the truth is of the Russian-Ukrainian problem. It's just too complicated. Right? And then where are you? Well, then you have a bunch of essentially conflicting opinions, and that's it. And some people will accept this, and some people will accept that, and you are not going to have a Disinformation Board engaged in censorship. Well, first, ferreting out. That's the first thing, ferreting out. So it kind of inquisitorial investigations. And then censoring, even if the censoring is solely in the form of saying, well, these people are wrong. The government says these people are wrong. That's kind of censorship, because people will look at that. Some people will look at that and say, oh, well, we got to go along with the government. Right? And those people who find themselves subject to that kind of pressure, what will they do? Well, they'll self-censor. They'll stop promoting those ideas, even if they may believe them to be true, because they don't want to be subject to this kind of pressure brought on them by the government, and pressure then brought on them by people outside of the government who are following the government's lead. And so you have witch hunts, if you know what I mean. All right? Government puts out the idea they're witches, and then there are a lot of people in the community saying, oh, we agree with that, and these are the witches over here, and we're going to do something to them. We're going to treat them as pariahs or whatever. Right? And so you have self-censorship because the individuals who may be subject to that kind of pressure don't want to become involved in the situation, no matter how much they may believe in the truth of what they're saying. And that's another problem, what they call the chilling effect of all of this. Even if it were just a bunch of blundering bureaucrats who were running around and giving their own opinions as to these matters, those opinions coming out of a government agency are going to have some sensorial effect on the targets, the people that the government agency says are engaged in disinformation. And those people will then, as I said, self-censor themselves. They'll stop talking about the things that cause the government agency to attack them. And that is what the Supreme Court has called over and over again in these First Amendment cases, the chilling effect. The chilling effect of government investigations, securities activities, subversive activities control board, various kinds of investigations that were conducted by Congress or state legislatures, which were dealing with attempts to tar, really, political opponents of the legislatures that were conducting the investigations. And the Supreme Court said, well, you can't do this, because the effect of this is to chill the willingness, the ability of people to exercise their First Amendment rights. They will stop speaking about certain issues, or they will speak in such a way that kind of parrots what the government wants to hear. They'll stop associating with people who speak in those undesirable manners. So association will be chilled. Speech, maybe petition of the government will be chilled, because if the government can say it's disinformation, well, then it's not a legitimate petition of the government, is it? Right? I mean, you look at the Ukrainian situation, people would have come forward today and say, well, the government should not be involved on one side or the other. The United States should not be sending weapons to Ukraine, and the United States should not be engaged in sanctions, certain kinds of sanctions against Russia. What the United States should do is set up some kind of international commission outside of NATO, outside of the EU, outside of the things that already exist, and bring in countries that are more or less neutral to look at this and come up with a determination. Now, if you were to petition that, an individual were to petition that in the present mindset of the government, if they had a disinformation board, wouldn't the disinformation board say, well, this petition is contrary to the policies of the United States government, it must be disinformation? Right? We want to suppress this in some way. So you couldn't even do that, potentially. So that it attacks the First Amendment with respect to all of those aspects. Speech, press, obviously, because a lot of what goes on in the internet is a form of press, right? Certainly some of the media aspects that are the media companies and so forth, but even an individual who's running his own blog can be said to be engaged in freedom of the press because he's trying to influence others who may go to his blog. Freedom of petition, as I just said, would be affected. It's conceivable that freedom of religion would be affected. Right? You've got this abortion question, which has, at least according to some people, religious components built in to it. And would those be attacked or subject to attack by a disinformation board? So the whole First Amendment, not just freedom of speech in this kind of simple-minded sense, would be affected. And then if there were a malign purpose to this new agency, that its real goal was to have some favored political effect for the people that have set it up. Of course, well, that's even worse, right? I mean, it's bad enough that even if I can't say the angels, because they wouldn't be angels, even if the bureaucrats were completely neutral politically, and they were determining disinformation based on their best reading of the facts presented to them, you would have all of these First Amendment problems. You'd probably have a Fourth Amendment problem because where are they getting these facts? You probably have a Fifth Amendment problem because certainly if you get into the area of defamation, which deals with the property one has in his own reputation, right? So there are three right there, First, Fourth, and Fifth Amendments. And that would be true even if the bureaucrats were acting in a neutral and honest sense.
Which seems to not be the case. I mean, it's so likely not to be the case. I mean, the three issues, as you mentioned, are very partisan and have to do with even the electoral process in general. It's like election interference. I mean, the whole idea that this could be nonpartisan seems almost naive in some sense. But I wanted to ask you, I mean, what are the ways that we can protect our free speech? Because, I mean, it's the First Amendment, freedom of speech and freedom of religion. I mean, it's the First Amendment for a reason, it's very important. So what are the ways that we can stand up against this?
Well, let me just go back. It's actually the Third Amendment. I think there were two amendments that came before that were not adopted. It was the First Amendment because it's the only one that talks about Congress. All the other amendments really relate not simply to the U.S. government, they relate to the states as well, if you think them through. But in any event, it's fundamentally important because if speech, association, petition, and ultimately religion can be controlled by a quote-unquote government, coercive body, which is what government is, right? Ultimately, a coercive body, then the whole concept of Republican form of government and what's called loosely democracy obviously fails, right? It failed, it's been assassinated. That's the best way to put it. So what can people do? Well, obviously, there has to be some real pushback from, I guess it's the Republicans, because this is a Democratic Party project, right? Biden group project. And they have to push back against this as much as they can now in Congress. Whether that will be effective or not, we'll see. But I should think that the Republicans would say, look, this thing is so bad that when we get into power, we are going to look at what, how should I put this, what kinds of civil or criminal investigations need to be put forward to determine why this was even promoted. You know, a lot of people say or think that a public official can't engage in criminal activity, and that's totally false, right? We even have a statute. Go look at them as an example. Title 18 of the United States Code, sections 241 and 242. They talk about people who, under color of law, violate civil and constitutional rights. Well, who are those people acting under color of law? Well, they are public officials, or they might be private officials acting in collusion with public officials, kind of conspiratorial activity, right? So there's no question. This has been decided in many Supreme Court cases. There's no question that public officials, in the course of their activity as public officials, can commit crimes. And one of those serious crimes is denying constitutional rights to ordinary citizens. Well, I don't know. I suppose somebody could look at this and say, oh, setting up a board of this kind, is this an intentional attempt to deny free speech to a huge number of people in our country? We can't even say how many they would be, but they'd probably be very large in number, because there are a large number of people that have serious problems with illegal immigration. There are a large number of people who have serious problems with electoral fraud. There are large numbers of people who don't believe in the Russian propaganda theories that have been thrown around since Trump ran for office back in, 2015, right? Large numbers of people, probably everyone who voted for Trump. How many people were that? 71 million or so, right? A large number of people. So setting up a board to shut them down, to prevent them from speaking to each other, and somehow to penalize them in one way or another, one might think that if that were done intentionally with the knowledge that this was a violation of the First Amendment, that would be a criminal violation of those statutes. Right? And there is no immunity from that. You hear about qualified immunity in the civil cases. There's no qualified immunity from criminal prosecution. So somebody might, I mean, I'm not necessarily doing it, but somebody might make that suggestion that what's being proposed here, on the margins at least, may be criminal. And I don't hear that. I hear a lot of talk about 1984 and the analogy to that, the Ministry of Truth, and this thing can't work, and it will be blah blah blah. How shall I put this? This thing will turn out to be kind of a boondoggle. And I said, well, maybe that's true. Maybe we're just dealing with bureaucratic types who have gone, off the deep edge in their zeal, right? But maybe there's more to it. I don't know. I don't have the documentation as to how this thing started. And obviously I haven't taken the depositions or the testimony of the people in the back room who were responsible for this. So we don't know. But I think it's extraordinarily serious, because if it ever gets to the point where they have such an agency which is capable in one way or another of actually penalizing the people whom they claim to be spreading disinformation, then it's a North Korean style, communist Chinese style of structure that we have. There's no question about it. And then how will you get rid of it? Well, you have to get rid of it through the electoral process, change the representatives in Congress, change the administration and in the presidency. But then what do? You say, well, we're just going to disband this thing, and we're not going to point out that it was at this level of seriousness. This is the problem with the whole government these days, and it's been for a long time. There is no real accountability and therefore there is no real responsibility for what they do. They can do any fool thing that they want because there is no accountability. They are not held accountable in any way. They're not held accountable even civilly, let alone criminally. And if you have no accountability with the levels of power that they claim that they can exercise, the direction in which that kind of a system will always move, it has always moved throughout history. I don't think there's ever been an example of it not moving in that direction. It's to tyranny. Unless some revolution intervenes. It's the experience of the Americans, right? Their principle was that the British system was moving to tyranny. It was moving away from the rights of Englishmen, by the way, not even the rights of Americans, the rights of Englishmen. And it was moving to tyranny. The whole Declaration of Independence is an indictment along those lines. The king and his minister did this, and we couldn't hold them accountable and make them responsible through the existing British parliamentary system. We appealed to the king, and he didn't listen. We appealed to his ministers in parliament. They didn't listen. We even appealed to our English brethren, the people who actually had the ability to vote for members of parliament. And they didn't listen. Nobody listened. And what was the alternative at that point? It was separation, independence, and that, of course, led to the War of Independence, right? So you create these situations that drive people. On the one hand, the people in control they can move further and further in the direction of tyranny, and they normally will, because people in those positions want to exercise more and more power, and the last thing they want to hear is criticism. And then the people on the other side, the people against whom the power is being exercised, they realize, well, nothing can be done through this system, because the system is rigged against them. And then that results in some kind of, quote-unquote, extreme reaction. So you look at something like this Disinformation Board, and even if these people are acting with the purest of motives, they're just plain stupid, which I never put that past the politician, that they're just stupid. And you can have intellectuals, you can have very smart people who are stupid. They really don't know what their interests are or the interests of other people are. No matter how intelligent they may be, their actions are not logical or really rational. But even if the people promoting this Disinformation Board are just plain stupid, they just don't understand the principles of the First Amendment, they're just confused, where will this go? At some point in time, if it gets cemented into the system, as administrative agencies tend to become cemented into the system, it will be taken over by the people who want to exercise power in a malign fashion. Right? Not the idealists who are just information, we're all going to speak the truth to each other, blah, 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 but some people who want to use it in order to promote malicious interests. And then how do you get rid of it? How do you get rid of it? When they're controlling the political debate, right? When they're controlling what you can say about them, how do you change this within the context of the present system, which depends upon political debate, right? Every time we have an election, what's going on? It's one candidate talking about, I'm so great, and the other guy is no good. And each one of them does that. And in many instances, they do it through disinformation, right? And we tolerate a certain amount, perhaps a little too much, disinformation in our political campaigns, which are supposed to be extraordinarily important because they put in the representatives who then run the government. We tolerate that disinformation because the alternative would be so bad that we can't envision an electoral system that would be controlled, and it would have to be controlled centrally with respect to what candidates can say. Right? The people, the voters, are supposed to figure that out every 2, 4, 6 years. Right? By what? By the adversarial process. By candidate A saying such and such, and candidate B coming back saying, no, that isn't true. The same thing that goes on in a courtroom, the adversarial process, where each side gets to put on whatever version of the facts it believes are true, we hope, that they're not lying, right? Or if they try to lie, the other side is in a position to expose that falsity without being subject to some kind of censorship. And this disinformation board that they're proposing, not proposing, and they're putting it into play. They already named the head of it, right? That they're putting into play is absolutely contradictory of that. And I find it's amazing people don't say the obvious practicality is, okay, disinformation board says X. Who gets to challenge X? Right? Disinformation board says that Jones's postings on the internet are Russian propaganda. Does Jones get some kind of a hearing? Can Jones require the disinformation board to present all of its evidence along the line of the Brady rule? It's got to present the evidence for plus the evidence against what the disinformation board is saying. It's got to open up its own files. Is anybody talking about that? What are the checks and balances? What is the responsibility of this board in terms of laying out all the information? Or can they always hide behind classified information theories? Oh, well, this is Russian disinformation, but we can't tell you why. We can't expose our sources. That's classified. That's from the CIA. That's from the NSA. That's whatever it is, right? In our intelligence community, the ones who, all those people who said the laptop, Hunter Biden's laptop, was Russian disinformation. We can't disclose that to you. You have to take our word for it. Well, that would never do in a courtroom. I mean, some prosecutor, keep coming back to the Brady concept, because this really ties into that structurally or kind of in the way it would operate. If a prosecutor withholds that kind of evidence, the exculpatory evidence, what happens when it's exposed that he did that? Well, the case may be reversed. The conviction may be reversed. Or, if you're still at the trial, the judge may throw the whole case out. The prosecutor may be sanctioned, held in contempt. Conceivably, the prosecutor could be disbarred. That's prosecutorial misconduct. It's a concept, right? What's the prosecutorial misconduct analogy that these people that are promoting this disinformation board are laying out? What happens if we have disinformation board misconduct of that kind? What happens? Oh, well, nothing happens, according to them. And one would think, well, that's the first thing. I wouldn't want to hear about this kind of a board at all, period. But if you couldn't answer that first question, what's the mechanism of accountability and responsibility here? Assuming that we could say that something like this would be a legitimate agency, what's the accountability and responsibility? Because even in a criminal case where you have a suspicion that the defendant, a reasonable suspicion because it had to go through a grand jury to get an indictment, right? You've gone through that whole process. So there was a reasonable basis for bringing this person to criminal trial. We have, among others, we have this Brady rule. All the facts have to be laid out. And the prosecutors can't hide anything. And if they do, there will be severe consequences. Case will be reversed, case will be dismissed, prosecutor will be sanctioned, etc., whatever they are. Right? And that's a constitutional proposition. It was based upon due process. Well, freedom of speech is part of due process. In fact, one could say that freedom of speech is probably higher than due process because it's what informs due process. It enables us to discuss whether due process has taken place or not. So one would think in anything like this, the very first thing that the proponents would say and that the opponents would demand is, what kind of accountability and responsibility mechanisms will be built into this so that all of these possible problems will be precluded, excluded, whatever word you want to use, prohibited. And we haven't heard that. And the reason is because they don't intend to have any of those limitations and controls. That's obvious. Because I think a person who's coming at this kind of with naive honesty would have said that right in the beginning. Oh, we're going to set up this kind of board, it will do this, and here's how it will be controlled. So that it won't be used simply to defame individuals that we don't like politically. It won't be used to put out our own kind of disinformation in the guise of truth, which we can use for political purposes. Right? It won't be used to promote certain kinds of special interests. And then we could debate that. And we'd say, well, this is insufficient, which it probably would be. Well, I can't imagine any system that they would set up that would be sufficient, especially when you're talking about something like Russian propaganda. How do you know it's Russian propaganda? Oh, well, the CIA told us. Can you give us that dossier? No, it's classified. Okay, forget it. We're not going to take your word for it.
It does seem like accountability is so important in that kind of an institution. It's like, well, who gets to decide what's the truth and on what basis? And how do you have any accountability, like you say, if everything's classified? We have a viewer question. You had mentioned earlier that really, I mean, obviously one solution to this and the lack of accountability and honesty in government, one solution is what happened with the War of Independence, where you just completely break off from the country there. And Sarge is wanting to know, with the way that things are going, do you see a 1776 moment on the horizon? I believe it's the only way to go back to a more honest system.
Well, I hope that isn't true. Because, once you open up that Pandora's box, anything can come out of it. Right? The reason that the War of Independence, or one reason, at least a lot of analysts will say, one major reason that the War of Independence was successful, that it turned into a world war. Right? You had France and Spain against England, and the American colonies seeking independence became allies of the French. Think of Yorktown as the classic example of that. Right? French helping Washington to defeat the British at Yorktown, which was the supposedly decisive battle of the war. But that's what happened. It wasn't something simply between the American colonists and England. It turned into a world war because other people saw an interest in taking part in that conflict. And I think the same would be true now, even on a larger scale. If this country went to a 1776 type situation, there's a much greater likelihood that other countries, China, Russia, whatever, would have to take an interest in that, and the whole thing would spiral out of control. It would be like another damn thing in the Balkans. Archduke Ferdinand and his wife Sophie get themselves assassinated by some fanatic, and a few weeks later starts a war that kills 14 million people and destroys the foundations of Western European civilization. So you don't want to, shall I say, hope for that situation to arise, because it is a fantastic Pandora's box. What has to happen is there has to be a group within the political hierarchy, and I'm talking about the elected officials and in some cases the appointed officials, who start demanding actual accountability. Now, that will come from the people themselves. It seems to me people talk a lot, but we don't have any group in this country that is actually demanding the accountability that we really need to have, which is criminal investigations of what the hell goes on in the government. I mean, at every level in the government, from the local to the state to the national. That's the only way. If you let them investigate themselves, they'll never find themselves guilty of anything. That's almost the first principle, right? You don't let the person who's charged conduct the investigation of himself. Very unlikely that he's going to find himself liable or civilly or criminally guilty. There has to be some other way to do this. And people are not demanding that. And that, of course, is the first step. If you don't get that, then you won't get anything else. Then you may end up in a 1776 Declaration of Independence situation. Right? But that's the key to it. You bring back accountability and responsibility in some way. And it's amazing, because here's an example of it right now. This has gotten so far that they are willing to come out of the woodwork. The totalitarians, I'm making an assumption, we're talking about people who have malign motives here. Totalitarians are willing to come out of the closet and say, we're going to set up a ministry of truth. And what you see on the networks, at least the ones that are critical of this, they say exactly that. Oh, well, look what they're doing. They're setting up a ministry of truth. We can't tolerate this. We can't tolerate this. Violation of the First Amendment. This is obviously an undercutting of everything that we understand to be the basis of Republican government, or as I like to say, democracy. Right? And then the question becomes, okay, so what? What are you going to do about it? And the only thing they seem to be thinking they're going to do about it is when they win the next election, the opponents win the next election, then they will dissolve this board. Well, what if they don't win the election because of the effects of this board? See, that's the fallacy built into this. That as soon as you set up a system like this, the concept that you can come back into power through the normal system of electoral politics all of a sudden becomes problematic. Why was the Ministry of Truth set up in 1984? It was to make it impossible for anyone to think their way beyond Big Brother. Right? The whole concept of good thinking, the Oceana New Dictionary, Newspeak, all of this was designed to make it impossible for you to think your way past Big Brother and to make any thought that you had that was in that direction a violation of some kind of law, criminal law, right? They'd pick you up. The police would pick you up. This would happen to Winston Smith, right? Bad thinking. Double plus bad thinking, right? And that's, you look at it and say, oh, that's what this is. And when a system like this is set up, you make it impossible for the accountability and responsibility mechanisms, weak as they are, of normal representative electoral democracy, so-called, to function. And then that's the end. Yeah, that's what I find. The Republicans are talking about this, and the various commentators are talking about this. Even some of the good lawyers out there, I hear, and they all miss the point, which is you have to have something that will shut this down and prevent it from happening ever again. And that means some people have to suffer some very severe consequences for even having suggested this. Now, maybe those consequences are, well, they'll never get elected again, or they'll never be appointed to any political board ever again, agency or what have you, right? They'll be sort of blackballed. Or maybe they will be prosecuted. And, of course, I'm not suggesting that that's necessarily the case, because you've got to look into the facts and determine who did what and why. But somebody should be suggesting that this is one of those, how shall I put it, look on the nodal point in history. If you let this thing happen, it will move the direction of the Ministry of Truth, no matter how benign and naive the mindset is of the people who are setting it up now. It will move in that direction because that's the natural inclination of individuals in that type of situation. They have that kind of power. They want to expand it and expand it and expand it, especially with respect to the concept of ideas. My ideas are good. Your ideas are bad. I want you to be suppressed. I don't want you to have influence. I'm going to shut you up. Especially. That's why you have the First Amendment, for heaven's sake.
Yeah, that is why we have the First Amendment, and that idea of accountability. I mean, that is one of the points. Even people with good intentions need accountability, because we can be blinded to different points of view, and we need that honest and rigorous debate between individuals, and we need the press to keep the public authorities accountable, because even if they have the best intentions, when obviously not always they do, but even if they do, they can be blinded to a lot of different points of view.
Well, the road to hell is paved with what?
Good intentions. Good
intentions. So even if these people are acting on the basis of good intentions, the situation they are created is rife for the success of people with bad intentions. And there's your problem. History has always shown that the people with bad intentions will take advantage of every opportunity you give them. And when you cement those opportunities into some kind of governmental agency, especially with this kind of power, then you have to believe that it's going to go in the wrong direction, and I would think very quickly. And I'm not saying it's just the Democrats. I mean, if a Republican's running this, they would be doing the same thing because the interest is in suppressing their opposition politically. And how do you do that? You do that by manipulating or suppressing speech. Because politics eventually comes down to hot air, right? People talking back and forth to decide what it is they're going to do. And so if you can control the narrative, you can control the dialogue, you can control the content of speech, and especially if you can cause your opponents to censor themselves because they're afraid of what may happen if they speak the wrong things, then of course that system is going to be driven in the wrong direction, no matter which political party gets into power.
All right. Well, Dr. Vieira, we really appreciate your time today. Before we let you go, where can our viewers find you online if they're interested in learning more and reading everything that you write? And did you have any last thoughts for our viewers?
Well, they can go to News with Views, one word, newswithviews.com, and they'll find an archive of mine, which has everything I've put up basically on the internet since, 2005. They have a lot of other things that are kind of loosely out there, speeches I've given and talks I've given, what have you. And they can also find a way to contact me at News with Views or through News with Views. And my final comment is, you can't have a free government without the eternal vigilance of the people. And that vigilance in this particular case has to be communicated. You have to be able to speak about what you see and how to deal with problems in the political realm. And we've now come to that final point of control. This has been going on since the turn of the 20th century, the centralization of power in different ways in Washington, D.C. And now the centralizers have finally come to the point, which is always true, well, they have to centralize control over dissent, right? To have really a centralization of power, you cannot have 2 points of view. And you certainly cannot have 2 points of view that could lead to a political party coming into power which would change the centralization, which would, especially roll back the centralization of power. Right? So the logical conclusion of all of this is you have to suppress, at some point in time, and we've gotten there, you have to suppress contradictory speech. That is, speech that contradicts the central power structure. And that was Orwell's theory. I shouldn't say theory, that was his observation. And quite correct. Quite obvious. And we said, well, that's what they did. And think of any dictatorship you want to pick up in the 20th century. Germany under Hitler, Italy under Mussolini, Soviet Union under Stalin especially, and now China. Do they all operate on this principle? Isn't there a kind of ministry of truth? Maybe it might be called that, but it functions that way. And if you're outside of the accepted dialogue, what happens to you? Well, you go to a concentration camp, you go to a work camp, you go to re-education camp, something bad happens to you. And that's exactly what's being proposed here, even if these people are so naive that they don't see it. That's the mechanism that they'll be setting up.
All right. Well, Dr. Vieira, we will put a link in the description of this video to your author page on newswithviews.com. Thank you so much for your time today and all the wisdom that you've shared with us. Yeah, once again, just thank you so much and God bless.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you.
Miles Franklin Precious Metals is one of America's oldest and most trusted bullion dealers. Miles Franklin is A+ rated and accredited by the Better Business Bureau, licensed and bonded, and has 0 complaints ever registered. Here at Liberty and Finance, we are licensed brokers with Miles Franklin. To order, simply call us, discuss your needs, and we will let you know our live inventory, prices, and availability, and lock in your order over the phone. Once your order is locked, the price is held for you regardless of market fluctuations, and the metals are reserved for you awaiting your settled payment. Within 1 business day of ordering, you will receive an email invoice detailing the order and payment instructions. Miles Franklin accepts payments by bank wire, ACH or electronic check, money order, check mailed priority mail, and cryptocurrency. The fastest forms of payment are bank wire and cryptocurrency. Upon settled payment, Metals will ship out within 3 to 5 business days. You will receive tracking information via email. Domestic shipping charges are $15 for any order under 500 ounces of silver or 10 ounces of gold. For orders larger than that, domestic shipping is free. The package will be double boxed, fully insured, and labeled discreetly, with no indication of the contents inside. For your privacy, the name Miles Franklin will not even be on the package. To talk to myself, Elijah, my brother Kaiser, or my father Dunnigan, call 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237.